Hello, everybody, and welcome to our course on human cultures. For this semester, we're going to be looking at what type of cultural diversity we have in different parts of the globe, as well as looking at some of the different elements within culture that anthropologists study. In essence, what we're going to do right here is talk about a little bit about kind of the course expectations that I have for you. There are weekly readings. Essentially, you won't really have to go outside of your textbook, but there is an assigned reading every week or an assigned chapter that you should be reading every week. There is an impact statement assignment. For this assignment, what you will essentially be doing is I will provide a folder on Brightspace that has all of the documentary videos, and you are to choose one of the documentary videos, watch it, and complete a written assignment on it. The details for it are in your syllabus. Same thing with the academic review assignment. You will need to acquire an additional book outside of your textbook for this course. I will provide a list of different ethnographies that you may choose from, or you may choose your own. If you do choose to use your own, just please shoot me an email, let me know which book you will be using, and the details for the academic review assignment are in the syllabus as well. There is a midterm exam as well as a final exam, and that's pretty much it. As long as you're able to kind of keep up with the weekly readings and work on those two assignments and have them in on time, you should be successful in this course. One of the things I would like you to do right away, if you did not already get my email a few weeks ago that talked about the syllabus and some of the course expectations, please take an opportunity, read the course syllabus, and become familiar with all of the expectations for this course. Some of the, a lot of the questions that I get are usually things that are answered quite easily just by reviewing the syllabus. So make sure you review that syllabus. The word anthropology itself is a combination of two Greek words, anthropos and logos, which is essentially put together meaning the study of man. So anthropologists study the human species in every kind of different aspect. We look at the biological history of the human species, looking at our evolution throughout time. We also have anthropologists who look at the variation in culture that we see amongst different human groups across the globe. So anthropology in and of itself is a very multifaceted discipline that looks at a lot of different areas within science. This is just a graphic showing you kind of the members of the human family tree and kind of our direct ancestors here. What we'll be focusing on is, strictly us, Homo sapiens, but we will talk a little bit about some of our ancestors like Homo erectus, as well as Homo habilis, as well as Australopithecus afarensis, or otherwise known as Lucy. And all of these members are kind of important in our evolutionary lineage to how we got to have that intellectual and social ability that has allowed us to build this thing called culture. So what we'll address here really quick before we start talking about some of the different elements of culture is what are our steps to humanness? What actually separates us from the rest of the animal kingdom? One of the things that we have that's kind of unique to us, or that unique to very few species on this planet, is bipedality, or the ability to walk on two legs. This process in our species started with one of our ancient ancestors, Ardipithecus ramidus, at or around 6 million years ago, and started to kind of really complete when we get to our Australopithecus afarensis at 3.5 to 4 million years ago. And so it just goes to show you that large-scale evolutionary change, like the moving to walking on two legs instead of four, takes millions of years to complete. At or around 5.5 million years ago, we start to lose our honing teeth. What we will notice when we start to look at other primates across the world is that they all have very sharp canines, right? And as humans, we are members of the primate family tree. So what makes humans unique? The fact that we do not have those sharp canines. And we'll talk about the reasoning for that. We have material culture at 3.3 million years ago, which is the development of stone tools. We have speech happening at or around 2.5 million years ago. We're not really 100% sure, right? Because speech is not something that we can really pinpoint to a single evolutionary change. So far in science, we know when the genetic mechanisms occurred in our genome that allowed for us to develop the neurological structures for speech, but we don't actually know when actual human speech really began. At around 1.0 million years ago, we have hunting or cooperative hunting, which is humans working in small tribal groups to hunt large game animals. And then at or around 11,000 years ago, we have the start of domesticated food, right? This is domesticating things like ancient rye and barleys and wheats, and the domestication of animals like dogs and oxen. But what I do want you to kind of keep in mind while you go through the literature for this course, as well as if you do any further reading into human evolution and archaeology and history in general, do not really hold firm to timelines, right? According to this list here, we have stone tools occurring 2 million years before hunting, which seems a bit fishy, right? Because stone tools are kind of necessary in order to cooperatively hunt, right? So it's kind of interesting. So we'll kind of talk about some of these things today, and then we'll move into talking about culture and all of its different facets. So our evidence for bipedalism, right, our first kind of marker on that list or that path to humanness is what we call the bow plan shift of our skeleton, right? Which in bow plan is just a fancy French word for saying the way our body is constructed, right? So we had a huge shift in our evolutionary history from being a creature very similar to a chimpanzee that walks on all four to a creature that walks on two. And there are two real distinct areas that you get a lot of evolutionary change with regards to the shift of locomotion. You get a lot of change in your pelvis as well as in your spine. We have something in our spine called lumbar lordosis, right, which is this big curvature in the lower end of our back, right? And what that does is it orients our gravity directly above our pelvis, which allows us to be able to walk on two legs without falling over one way or the other. And this is sometimes referred to as your bipedal gait. So we also have the loss of our non-honing teeth, right? If we look at our closest genetic relative, chimpanzees, their canines are very big. And that's because canines in primate species are designed for behavior. They're not designed for food. They're not designed for hunting or anything like that. They're designed for scaring other primates away. So the reduction in the size of canine teeth over the time in our own evolutionary history indicates a behavioral tendency in our species towards cooperation rather than vicious competition with one another, right? A fun fact or kind of a trend that we see with primates in general, whether we're looking at gorillas, baboons, spider monkeys, or lemurs, we see that the longer and sharper the canine teeth are, the more competition for mates that we see within that given species, right? So the fact that human males don't have large canines means that human males are not viciously competing with one another over access to mates. And just to show you some of the general changes that we see in human teeth over time, of course, we talked about the reduction in canines, but also our enamel has become thinner. There's an increased incidence of cavities over time, actually really kind of taking off once we get to domesticated food. Once we kind of started eating a lot of high starch foods, you know, wheats, rye, corns, things like that, we start to see large incidences of dental decay. We also have a reduction in the size of our molars. If we look at some of our more recent evolutionary ancestors like Homo neanderthalensis or Homo erectus, they had very large molar teeth, right? And this kind of relates back to what their diet was. But as we shifted to eating more meat and to eating domesticated foods, which were much softer, we didn't need those very large teeth anymore. So our enamel became thinner and our molars became smaller. So this is showing you, the next slide over will also show you, these are kind of your Oldowan tools. This is the earliest material culture or earliest stone tools. And these Oldowan tools were not meant for hunting, right? These Oldowan tools originally were meant for scavenging, for kind of coming to a kill site that perhaps a lion or a cheetah or another large predator killed a animal, and kind of chasing them off and beginning to scavenge that carcass, right? So what we see in Oldowan tools is a lot of scrapers, a lot of these kind of sharp-edged rocks that are used for cracking open long bones. But what you'll see in the next slide is something called Acheulean and Mousterian tools, and those are the ones that were truly made for original hunting. And you'll see that those kind of look a little bit more like what we have seen in these things called spear points as well as arrowheads. As a caveat, though, I don't want you to get into the idea that hunting itself or hunting in groups is a human unique trait, right? We actually have many, many species of birds as well as dogs, wolves and such that hunt cooperatively in groups. So cooperative hunting is not unique to humans, which is something that we once thought in anthropology. This is just showing you a picture of chimpanzees that have just gotten done from a cooperative hunt. You can actually kind of see them eating the carcass of a red colobus monkey. And this just goes to show you, chimpanzees actually have a very complicated and unique system by which they hunt in groups. Essentially, they will scatter out and circle a prey and then slowly close in, working cooperatively with one another to kind of scare their prey into a specific area so that they can capture it. So this just shows you that our closest living relatives, chimpanzees, are also capable of kind of very high-ordered or hunting that requires a high degree of intelligence. And then the last item on our list, right, we talked about the domestication of wild plants and animals, and this came with a whole set of advantages and disadvantages. We talked about one of them, which was the increase in dental decay that occurred after we started to domesticate certain crops, but we also have instances of increases in diseases, things like syphilis and tuberculosis. Those were originally animal diseases that jumped across to humans once we began the process of domesticating things like oxen and goat and cows. So to share some of our kind of commonality that we have with other forms of life on this planet, right? Keep in mind that humans share over 99.8% of our DNA with chimpanzees. And we know based on our evolutionary lineage that we diverged from chimpanzees at or around 7 million years ago. Just as another example, we share 70% of our DNA with slugs, right? And we are really separated from the other great apes in the primate family based on our ability to learn and use symbolic language. And really, symbols and symbolic language is really the kind of conveyor of cultural information, right? So symbols are exceptionally important in our species. Something that also makes humans very unique is we are one of the few mammals on the planet, or one of the few mammal species that lacks something called a baculum. And a baculum is a kind of a hard detached bone that is inside of the male sexual organs of mammal species. And what those are designed to do, or what we hypothesize that they're designed to do, is to kind of lock in females during copulation and to make copulation a little more easy, because in the animal kingdom, copulation is not always consensual, right? There is a lot of instance of, what we would call in our species rape, right? So humans do not have this bone, but our closest living relative, or our closest genetic living relative, the chimpanzees, do have them. So this is just another piece of evidence that shows that humans overall, very early in our evolutionary history, opted for cooperation and friendliness with one another rather than competition and forced copulation. So if you haven't kind of gathered the trend by now over the last few slides here, what we're going to do in this class is we're going to look at the intersection of culture and evolutionary theory, right? Really the question is, can the development of culture be seen from an evolutionary perspective? And we'll talk about a few people in the School of Psychological Anthropology that firmly believe, yes, you can look at culture as this ever-evolving entity, right? So I want you to kind of take a second here and think about any society, can you think of any deleterious cultural traits, ones that would actually affect our ability as a species to evolve any further? Before we get into defining culture and beginning to look at cultural elements, let's look at how culture is transmitted from generation to generation, right? In essence, we learn culture, right? Culture is both learned and taught, and cultural practices are passed from generation to generation by this process that we refer to as enculturation, right? So culture is not biologically passed like genes, rather it is gained through experience and active teaching by our elders and our peers, right? So defining enculturation, it is defined as the process of learning one's cultures, including acceptable behaviors and taboos or unacceptable behaviors. In every culture, we have institutions of enculturation, right? These are institutions which act to teach our young ones the culture of the place you are living in, right? So enculturation, in essence, comes in many forms, right? Cultures developed these institutions for enculturating children, like churches, even certain types of media, schools, as well as laws and medical systems are just a few examples of institutions of enculturation, right? But like our chimpanzee cousins, most enculturation occurs between parents and offspring. So this course will cover how to interpret anthropological data through the lens of cultural anthropology, right? We will look at cultural diversity and all of the kind of different expressions of culture that we see in different parts of the globe. The goal of this course is to teach you about cultural anthropology as well as give you a toolkit to use on your own when coming into contact with a culture different than your own, right? This course will cover sensitive topics that affect Western and non-Western cultures, such as gender, sexuality, ethnicity, race, and nationalism, just to name a few, right? So all I ask is that as you move through the materials, you keep an open mind and look at what I'm presenting to you and look at the evidence and the data behind it. So as we move through the course, we will start by defining anthropology and what it means to be an anthropologist. The course will then move on to anthropological techniques and an overview of some of the features which cultural anthropologists study when looking at a particular culture. And then the course will conclude by covering global issues which affect multiple cultures and how those cultures respond to said global issues, things like climate change, immigration, cultural contact, racism, etc. Just to review, remember, anthropology itself is the study of man, right? It comes from those two Greek words, anthropos and logos. In essence, it's the study of humans. It is the branch of knowledge that deals with the scientific study of humans, their works, their behaviors, their bodies, and values within a given space and time. There are different subfields within anthropology. That's why we call it a multi-field discipline. And we'll take a little bit of time to define each of these here in a second. But we have archaeology as one branch, biological, or sometimes known as physical anthropology. We have cultural anthropology, which is the course topic for the course you're taking right now. We have linguistics as well as applied anthropology, right? So be sure as we move through the course to know the definition and subject of study for each of these subfields, right? Anthropology itself is a multidisciplinary pursuit, meaning that anthropologists will generally consult with experts in various fields instead of making assumptions, right? So if we, as an example, I myself am classically trained as an archaeologist, right? So if I come to a prehistoric site and I find a stone tool that I'm not able to really recognize and I have no idea what stone it's made out of, I'm not going to just guess, right? I'm going to call in a geologist who will be able to tell me what exactly this stone tool is made out of, right? So it's that ability to kind of use experts of different fields in order to make your scientific study of culture or your scientific study of humans to be much more valid. So to define archaeology itself, it's the study of past peoples and cultures through the material remains that they leave behind. And material remains, or otherwise known as artifacts, can include things like ceramics and stone tools, as well as bio-artifacts with things like your own skeleton. Unfortunately, the work of archaeologists is not nearly as exciting as some Hollywood depictions like Indiana Jones. You would be surprised to know that in many cases, when we are out in the field digging at a site that we think ancient people were living at, we may find next to nothing. We may actually spend the entire field season out digging and find absolutely nothing, right? That is kind of the risk that you take as an archaeologist. In archaeology, each layer of soil is meticulously documented, and the location of each artifact is noted both in vertical and horizontal space, right? So archaeologists construct these things that we refer to as profile maps, which show us each individual layer of the earth and where the artifacts were found within that layer, right? It helps us to provide a timeline of how long a group of people may have been occupying a particular area. Archaeology itself, or the field of archaeology, is very diverse. Some archaeologists focus exclusively on ceramic vessels, and some archaeologists focus on arrowheads, and others, like myself, focus on the skeletal materials as well as the biological byproducts of life. If you're interested, you can take a look at my own research, which is reconstructing prehistoric diets using fossilized tooth plaque called dental calculus. Archaeology itself, if we look at it from a global perspective, it is not the same everywhere, right? The field methods for archaeology can vary depending on the type of site you're working on. For example, underwater archaeologists cannot draw profile maps of their test pits because in some cases they do not dig any, right? It's very difficult to dig a hole at the bottom of the ocean without sand filling it in, right? The field of archaeology is broken up essentially by geography, right? For the aspiring archaeology or archaeologist, it is prudent to research the best schools for North American prehistoric archaeology if that is your area and geographic region of interest, right? If you're interested in ancient Egypt, you would look for schools that specialize in ancient Egyptian archaeology, or sometimes known as Egyptology. The overall goal of archaeology as a discipline is to present a snapshot of the past based off of those material remains that people leave behind. So, and it's really important to kind of understand that limitation, right? We're only providing a snapshot of the past, right? We're not providing a cohesive timeline. We're not giving you extremely definitive answers on when people lived at a particular site, how long they may have lived there. In a lot of cases, archaeologists are just simply inferring what we think happened based on these material remains that are left behind. If we look at biological/physical anthropology, this is the branch of anthropology that studies human origins and comparative anatomy. Biological anthropologists seek to illuminate the evolutionary history of our species using evidence from the fossil record, right? So kind of one of the annoying jokes that archaeologists tell to each other is, a lot of times that we are out in the public, people think that we work with dinosaur bones, which we don't. Archaeologists in themselves are dealing with humans only, and we don't even deal with fossils at all. But biological/physical anthropologists do deal with fossils, but they only deal with fossils from our branch of the evolutionary tree. There are a lot of different topics that are covered within biological anthropology, or that a biological anthropologist will study. We have bipedality in humans, or looking at that bow plan shift to moving to two legs. We also have behavioral comparisons between humans and other living primates. How similar are we behaviorally to our closest living relative, the chimpanzees? We also look at changes in other parts of the human skeleton over time, like changes in the skull with the increase in brain size over time, things like that. We also have, of course, forensics, which we've all kind of seen on TV with shows like CSI and that show Bones. We also have how DNA affects skeletal structures across species. One of the things that we do notice is there are common genes which dictate structures across multiple species. We're actually going to talk about that in our week when we talk about evolutionary theory. It's actually kind of amazing that just a few set of genes controls the skeletal development across whether we're looking at humans or beavers or giraffes. It's the same set of genes that regulate that development of the skeletal structure. And then, of course, we have the linguistics branch of anthropology, which is the study of the construction, use, and form of language in human populations over time. We will talk a little bit about linguistics in this class. I don't go into a whole lot of detail about it because it's very, very detail oriented, and sometimes it can bog down introductory anthropology students, which I do not want to do. But in linguistics, they look at things like speech sounds, words, phrases, and sentences, the literal meanings of those phrases and sentences, and then, of course, that meaning and how it changes in context or discourse, right? So this is really our study of language and all of the different variations of language within our species. So linguists would study things like the composition of language, something like language borrowing. A lot of words that we have in the English language are actually borrowed words. Two of them that I will tell you from that come from Central America from the indigenous Mayan people are the words cocoa and shark. In the Mayan language, cocoa is pronounced as cacao and shark is pronounced as shoke. But with a little bit of tweaking of the phonetic sounds, we get the English words cocoa and shark. They also look at how languages interact and change over time, as well as classifying different languages based on similarities. And then we have cultural anthropology, right, which is essentially the course subject material for the class you're taking right now. And this is the study of people's communities, their behaviors, their beliefs, then their institutions of enculturation. And this also includes how people make meaning within their given society. And a lot of the kind of instances, cultural anthropology is almost an old phrase, right? I know that when we talked about the subfields of anthropology, I mentioned something called applied anthropology. And applied anthropology is actually kind of the new phrase for cultural anthropology, right? It's no longer kind of enough for anthropologists to go out and just study different cultures. We want to use our anthropological techniques in order to help solve real world problems, right? Like developing irrigation systems, like you're seeing in the picture in the bottom corner, or whether you're looking at an anthropologist who's looking to study high altitude adaptations amongst these Andean people that you see in the bottom right. So we've kind of mentioned this word culture quite a bit throughout the presentation so far. So now we come to the part where we actually define culture. If you were to do a Google search of culture, you're going to find many, many different definitions, right, depending on who you're asking. The definition that I like to use, or the one that most anthropologists use, is one that was actually written quite some time ago by a guy named Edward Burnett Tyler in 1881. So for our intents and purposes here, we are going to define culture as the complex whole, which includes knowledge, beliefs, arts, morals, laws, customs, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by a human as a member of society. So anthropology in and of itself is what we call holistic discipline. It seeks to uncover as many factors facing human existence as possible. When looking at a culture, we're concerned with the culture's language, the settlement patterns of that culture, the symbols that the culture use, how that culture interprets a natural world in relation to their own bodies, and how they interpret other cultures different from their own, right? So we use this concept of holism, right, which is anthropology's commitment to consider the full scope of human life, including culture, biology, history, and language across time and space. Anthropologists also seek to promote cultural understanding and illuminate the scope of human diversity, both culturally and biologically, right? So what we're seeking to do is to dispel this notion of ethnocentrism. And ethnocentrism is defined as that strong human tendency to believe that one's own culture and way of life is natural, normal, and superior to the beliefs and practices of other cultures, right? So in essence, really, in other words, this is just saying that you, as a member of your culture, believe that the way you guys do things is normal, right? Because that's what you grew up with and that's what you were born with. And what we're seeking is to kind of dispel that notion, to kind of open up an understanding that there are many different ways in which people live, right? There's many different types of life histories and life ways amongst different cultures. So as a social science, you might be wondering, how does cultural anthropology present its findings? Well, cultural anthropologists engage in a type of research referred to as participant observation, right? This means they participate in the daily lives of the people from the culture they are studying. The anthropologist then records everything they see and hear during their field work in something called a field journal, right? Cultural anthropologists will generally compile their findings into two types of works called ethnographies and ethnologies, right? And in this course, you're actually going to read an ethnography and kind of experience what that piece of work is like, right? We don't cover a whole lot of ethnologies, but you'll find out the reason for that here in a second. So to talk about the differences between ethnographies versus ethnologies, an ethnography is a systematic study of a people and culture, right? It's designed to explore cultural phenomenon where the researcher observes society from the point of view of the subject of study, right? Ethnographies generally come in the form of books or academic papers published in research journals. An ethnography is a compilation of the research data cultural anthropologists accumulate during their fieldwork, right? And an ethnology, on the other hand, is a comparison of cultural features presented in multiple ethnographies, usually covering the cultures of a specific geographic region. So, for example, if we wanted to know how do the Maori tribe paint their faces, that would be something you would find in an ethnography, right? Because that's a specific cultural element that is specific to that culture. If we wanted to know how different peoples of the South Pacifics use the ocean or use the sky to navigate while they are going on oceanic journeys, that would be something that you would find in an ethnology, because that's going to take multiple ethnographies of multiple groups of people and compare the same cultural element. In this term, in this example, we're using navigation across different cultures. So to give you an example of an ethnography, and this is actually one of the ethnographies on the list that you can choose to do your academic review on, we have an anthropologist named Seth Holmes who lived and worked amongst the migrant workers from Oaxaca, Mexico. He followed them from their homes in Mexico along their annual migration to the United States to work as produce pickers. Holmes's work sought to illuminate the plight that migrant workers face, including but not limited to low wages, deleterious health effects due to bad working conditions, as well as no access to medical care. More importantly, Holmes worked to understand the relationship between the structural violence opposed upon migrant workers and the people and mechanisms that create structures committing the violence. So, like we said, ethnologies seek to compare cultural data within multiple ethnographies. They use ethnographic information to illuminate observed patterns that we see across all human cultures, something that we refer to as cultural universals. In the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, there existed a Bureau of Ethnology sponsored by our government. This government agency sought to record and compare various Native American cultures before they vanished forever. In many instances, these ethnological reports today are all the information that we have on some of these native tribes which are no longer around.